Welcome. I am Justin Perney with Prison Professors. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this YouTube video, or if you are driving and listening to our podcast, thank you. We know you are very busy and we want to provide a lot of value. And in this specific video or podcast, we're going to discuss avoiding obstruction of justice. Unfortunately, I know a lot about obstruction of justice because when I was a defendant a long time ago, I engaged in and I obstructed justice. And as a result of those bad choices, it helped compel or really push the government towards threatening to indict me. And ultimately, I pled guilty to white collar crime, in part because I obstructed justice. The cover up sometimes, as they say, is worse than the crime. So we want to make sure all of you avoid any obstruction of justice charges. And if unfortunately you've made some bad decisions that bring you into the crosshairs of government investigators, we want to make sure that you don't make matters worse. Indeed, as we'll talk about in this article that was written at prisonprofessors.com. And while I'm talking about prisonprofessors.com, I encourage you to go there and to digest tons of our free content from blogs and videos and podcasts to ensure that you're on the right track. Stop Googling your way through prison and trying to understand what happens. There's so much misinformation out there. And just because someone writes it doesn't mean that it's true, or the information provided may be applicable to them and not necessarily help you. So we want to make sure you're getting the right information. So the content that our team provides comes from decades of experience. Everyone on our team has traversed the system, and we like to think the knowledge that we're providing is spot on and absolutely will help you. So please check out prisonprofessors.com. Now, as we transition to how to avoid obstruction of justice, we want to embrace the reality that unfortunately some people like me try to take matters into their own hands when they get into trouble, when they begin making some bad decisions. And part of the way that they'll do that is by thinking, well, I've always had success. I'm a salesperson. Things have always gone my way. I'm a closer. I can influence this. I can manipulate this. I've done it before. I can do it again. I'm not saying everyone has bad intentions. I wanted the government to see me as a good person. I didn't want them to think I was someone that could break the law. So I tried to paint myself in the most positive picture possible. And in so doing, I was spinning lies and living in denial and going down this very cliched, slippery slope. So I think it's very important to understand, if you are in the crosshairs of a government investigation, that you understand how little decisions, things that you think are benign or innocent, can be construed negatively by a government investigator, could be construed by obstruction of justice. Indeed, over the years, our team at Prison Professors has gotten calls from defendants who were told they were going to be getting a new charge for obstruction of justice. They'll say, well, what happened? It could be very subtle. I spoke to a co-defendant inadvertently, but I didn't mean to. He called me and we spoke, but I was told not to, obstructing the investigation. Something as simple as that, right? A conversation, an opportunity, picking up the phone, saying something you weren't supposed to, whether to get off the phone or trying to make yourself feel better, or trying to potentially get aligned in a very subtle way on the messaging, could be construed as an obstructing investigation. Successful defendants understand the stakeholders. They understand that they may not view you as the executive or father or husband or wife that you are, but rather for crimes you may have committed. So if you can understand their perspective and understand how cynical they are and how they are looking for you to make a mistake, you're going to better understand how truly every decision influences your life, because it will influence your freedom. And I mentioned a moment ago, this very cliched slippery slope. Courts have upheld obstruction of justice charges and enhanced prison sentences based on mere statements of hope. For example, in this blog we reference at prisonprofessors.com, a defendant told his girlfriend, I hope and pray to God you didn't say anything about a weapon. The government alleges through that simple statement, he crossed the line. An obstruction charge was coming. So to avoid these sorts of charges, it's essential to learn the different ways that people are accused of obstructing justice, from witness tampering to retaliation to hiding evidence. It's essential that you are aware of everything you think, everything you say, every text, every email, every meeting, every message. These things are crucial because they're going to affect your case, and that's ultimately going to determine if you go to prison and for how long. Again, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, because I lied to the government when they interviewed me, that was a big part of the reason I went to prison. Imagine had I responded properly, honestly, I want you to do the same thing. Our whole team wants you to do the same thing. We've all been through this experience and we've learned a lot. We want to pass it along to you, but you've got to implement these lessons. Obstruction of justice can present, of course, a lot of potential outcomes in both state and federal courts, from a non-prosecution agreement to probation to prison, everything you could possibly imagine. So it's essential you understand how. Here's a good way that I can describe it. Years ago, a client of ours engaged in conduct for many, many years. He had engaged in a fraud for like 5 or 6 years, unfortunately. And then he got in trouble, and his lawyer tried to take the argument, well, this was out of character, it was out of conduct. And the government said, well, it's not really that out of character, out of conduct. It's been 5 or 6 years that he engaged in this fraud, as we see it. Then boom, as soon as this defendant got into trouble, he, according to the government, obstructed. And then they're like, well, here he goes again. He continues to break the law. He continues to make bad decisions. So it furthered their narrative that this guy is just really a career criminal. He does nothing but cheat and try to advance his own interests at the expense of others. Everything you do, every step you make, they're watching. So let's talk about some obstruction cases, going back a little ways. As many of you know, back in the baseball days and the performance-enhancing and drug days, the PEDs, the steroids, the growth hormone, and many athletes from Barry Bonds to Alex Rodriguez, who else? Mark McGwire, a baseball player from USC, my alma mater, caught up in these scandals. Specifically, Marion Jones pled guilty to obstruction of justice for making false statements to federal agents about her use of performance-enhancing drugs. Again, it wasn't the fact that she used PEDs. It was for making false statements, for lying. The cover-up, as the cliche holds, is worse than the crime. She was sentenced to 6 months. Beyond the prison term, it's the felony conviction. It's the damage to her reputation. It's her ability to secure and gain endorsements. It's devastating. So it's one thing to say, okay, I did drugs I should not have. That's hard enough. Okay, that would have been truthful. But making matters worse and covering it up is what sent her to prison. And Barry Bonds, now ultimately his case was, as I understand it, dismissed. He was convicted of obstruction of justice charges, and the conviction was dropped ultimately by the Department of Justice in 2015. But for many years, Barry dealt with years of investigations, indictments, millions of dollars in legal fees for an evasive answer the government says he gave to a grand jury in 2003. But what are the consequences for someone like Barry Bonds? Well, the case was dismissed, and even if it was upheld, he'd only gone to prison for a few months, if at all. He'll never be in the Hall of Fame. And as a former baseball player, I can tell you, he was a Hall of Famer when he played for the Pittsburgh Pirates. He was a Hall of Famer before he ever went to San Francisco. But as a result of his cheating, he's not in the Hall of Fame. You don't see him on TV doing endorsement deals. He may still be a coach. The point is, obstructing justice led to a massive government investigation that nearly sent him to prison, and it tarnished his reputation and legacy, unfortunately. Coming back to the financial services industry, where I worked for many years, there's Martha Stewart. People presume Martha Stewart went to prison for her conduct and some stock trading. No. Martha Stewart tried to hamper an investigation into her stock sales by misleading and attempting to tamper with her broker's phone records. Again, to read the whole blog, go to prisonprofessors.com, where we talk about how to avoid obstruction of justice. In Martha's case, she served a sentence of 10 months for lying and obstruction of justice. Her stockbroker was also found guilty of making false statements, obstruction, perjury, and conspiracy. DOJ never convicted Stewart for insider trading or securities fraud. So again, it comes back to the cover-up is worse than the crime. Essentially, you avoid Department of Justice, you avoid obstruction of justice issues by simply telling the truth, by working openly with your lawyer. Or if you're not prepared to speak openly and honestly, assert your right not to speak. But if you speak, you should tell the truth. You cannot lie, because the majority of what the government asks you, they already know the answer to. Wrapping up how to avoid obstruction of justice charges, we can go to the case of Frank Quattrone, an executive and investment banker who served 18 months for obstruction and witness tampering. Yes, an appeals court later overturned his conviction due to faulty jury instructions, but that doesn't happen a whole lot. It doesn't change the inconvenience, the stress, the money, the heartache, the embarrassment of having to go through a government investigation. Why? Because he did something which he may have considered subtle, which he thought he would easily be able to defend, namely telling employees to clean up files during the course of an investigation, essentially telling others to destroy evidence. Of course, that's obstruction of justice. As we wrap up this video and podcast on what exactly is obstruction of justice. It's a crime at both federal and state levels. Obstruction criminalizes any conduct where a person willfully interferes with the orderly administration of justice, impeding, influencing, or obstructing any proceeding before a federal court or Congress could fall within the purview of obstruction. Without getting too into the details, it is 18 U.S. Code Section 1503 defines obstruction of justice as an act that corruptly or by threats of force or by threatening letter or communication influences, obstructs, impedes, endeavors to influence, obstruct, or impede the due administration of justice. I think you get it. Okay. Essentially, it's what we teach our children in kindergarten when they're young. Tell the truth. Don't cover it up. Don't make matters worse. Last, I'm going to say, here are some specific examples of obstruction of justice. And think about this. If you're currently a defendant or going through an investigation, think to yourself, have you done any of these things? Have you considered doing any of these things? Have you done them and think, oh, it's not that big a deal? Because if you have and you haven't gotten caught, don't roll the dice and double down and say, thank you, I didn't get caught. Thank you, I heard this video or listened to this podcast of Prison Professors. I'll never do it again. So specific types of obstruction include hiding evidence, tampering with evidence, destroying documents, as I mentioned a moment ago in the Frank Quattrone case, intimidating witnesses, victims, or informants, bribing or attempting to pay off witnesses to provide false testimony, threatening court officials, members of the jury, orchestrating delays in court proceedings, providing false information to law enforcement officials. That's what I specifically did when they asked me questions rather than tell the truth. I lied. And lastly, lying under oath or perjuries. One of the most common obstruction of justice charges is tampering with a criminal investigation or prosecution witness. Again, to read the whole blog and get more tips on avoiding obstruction of justice, simply go to prisonprofessors.com. And I will close with what sounds so obvious, right? It sounds so obvious that if you've gotten into trouble, you're not going to make matters worse. You're not going to make decisions that would expose you to a longer time in prison. But at Prison Professors, we've worked with thousands of people for many, many years. And in our experience, the fear of going to prison, the fallout of losing your career and the shame and embarrassment can very easily and does compel people to continue to make bad decisions, to convince themselves they'll be treated differently, to convince themselves they can get themselves out of this, to convince themselves that they have the skill set or the maneuverability to influence. And they convince themselves through rationalization that it's not that big a deal and it's just a conversation. And of course, the government sees it differently. If you really want to avoid an obstruction of justice charge, it requires introspection, thinking, and determining and concluding that you don't want to make matters worse, concluding that you've put your family through enough already, and lying and covering up is only going to make it worse. Thank you so much for watching this video. Again, go to prisonprofessors.com. If you're on YouTube, subscribe. If you are listening to our podcast in iTunes, please subscribe. And if you find value in our work, leave a comment or review. Thank you so much. Look forward to returning with more content soon. Goodbye.